Terminator franchise. No franchise in science fiction has died and been resurrected as many times as Terminator, and the 2019 attempt to raise it finally put a bullet in it for good. Terminator Dark Fate arrived as a direct sequel to Terminator 2 Judgment Day, a film that simply ignored every installment made in between. James Cameron came back as producer and story architect for the first time since Terminator 2 in 1991, and Linda Hamilton returned as Sarah Connor. On paper, it was the reunion fans had been asking for. The reality was a production budget reported somewhere between $185 and $196 million, with another $80 to $100 million spent on marketing. By most estimates, the film needed to clear over $450 million worldwide just to break even. It opened to a limp $29 million domestically, then finished with $62.3 million at home, $198.9 million overseas, and $261.1 million worldwide. That left Paramount, Skydance, and their partners staring at a loss of roughly $122.6 million, one of the biggest bombs of the year. Almost immediately, sources close to Skydance confirmed there were no plans to continue the franchise. And here's the real reason it collapsed. Dark Fate wasn't killed by one bad movie. It was killed by Terminator 3, Terminator Salvation, and Terminator Genesis before it, each one rebooting the timeline and asking the audience to start over. By the time the original creator finally came back, nobody trusted the brand enough to show up. Director Tim Miller has since noted the film eventually turned a profit through streaming and other deals, but the theatrical franchise was already gone. Independence Day. The original made over $800 million, and its sequel proved that a disaster movie is only as big as the star who walks away from it. Independence Day Resurgence landed in 2016, a full 20 years after the 1996 original. The problem was written into it from the start. Will Smith declined to return, choosing Suicide Squad instead, and since the two shoots overlapped, doing both was impossible. Roland Emmerich came back to direct, and the film quietly killed off Smith's character off-screen. On a production budget of roughly $165 million, it opened to just $41 million domestically and stalled out around $103 million at home and $389 million worldwide. Compare that to the original's $817 million, and the drop tells the whole story. Resurgence had even set the table for a third film, one where humanity finally takes the fight to the alien homeworld, but the weak box office buried those plans on arrival. Emmerich later admitted he regretted making it without Smith. That's the real reason this one fell apart. The franchise was built on one irreplaceable face, and without him, the reunion felt hollow. A single casting loss collapsed a planned trilogy before it could even begin. Men in Black. 3 films had opened above $50 million, and then the reboot without Smith and Jones opened to less than any of them. Men in Black International arrived in 2019, with Chris Hemsworth and Tessa Thompson stepping in for Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. It opened to roughly $30 million, the first film in the series ever to open below 50. On a reported budget of $110 million, with break-even estimated near $300, it barely scraped $250 million worldwide, a real loss. Sony chairman Tom Rothman blamed a story that wasn't strong enough, and critics agreed, handing it a 23% on Rotten Tomatoes. The real reason it fell apart is simple. This franchise mistook the suits for the stars, and no amount of globetrotting could replace the chemistry that carried the originals. Divergent. This is the franchise that fell apart so completely, it couldn't even finish telling its own story, leaving fans stranded on a cliffhanger forever. The Divergent series ran through Divergent in 2014, Insurgent in 2015, and Allegiant in 2016. Then it hit a wall. Allegiant grossed just $179.2 million worldwide, against a $142 million budget, the lowest in the series, and a steep fall from the roughly $300 million Insurgent had pulled the year before. The reviews had cratered too, with Insurgent at 28% and Allegiant at 11% on Rotten Tomatoes. The planned finale, Ascendant, was scrapped as a theatrical film. Lionsgate tried to salvage it as a television movie with a new cast, but in December 2018, Starz announced it was no longer pursuing the project, citing a lack of interest from the cast. And that was it. The series simply ended after 3 films, the adaptation permanently unfinished. That's what makes it the definitive young adult dystopia collapse. The bubble burst mid-story, and the ending was never told. By the way, if you're enjoying this so far, I put out videos like this all the time, and a subscribe would genuinely help the channel. Thanks. Total Recall. Verhoeven's original was a violent, twisted classic, and the glossy 2012 remake proved a reboot needs more than sharper visual effects. Directed by Len Wiseman and starring Colin Farrell, the new Total Recall carried a budget estimated at $125 million. It opened to roughly $26 million domestically, and though it climbed to around $59 million at home and $198.4 million worldwide, that was never enough to clear the red. The film dropped the Mars setting and the ambiguity of the 1990 original, stripping out everything strange and memorable. Any hope of a sequel was shelved for good. The real reason it died is the oldest one in Hollywood. Spectacle alone can't relaunch a brand when you've thrown away the thing that made it worth watching. The Matrix. The trilogy that redefined science fiction spent 2 decades slowly bleeding goodwill, and the 2021 revival finally confirmed the magic was gone. The Matrix Resurrections arrived in December 2021, 18 years after the Matrix Revolutions. This time, Lana Wachowski directed alone, without her sister Lily. On a production budget around $190 million, the film made a choice that doomed its theatrical run. It opened simultaneously in theaters and on HBO Max, and the streaming release gutted ticket sales. It grossed a franchise low of roughly $160 million worldwide, about $157 million of that in actual theaters. The opening was brutal, just $22 million over a 5-day holiday frame, nearly 50% below expectations, landing 5 days after Spider-Man: No Way Home swallowed the entire market. But the collapse started long before this. The Matrix Reloaded and Revolutions, back in 2003, had already split the fanbase, widely seen as a step down from the original. The reviews for Resurrections were just as polarizing, with many calling the whole thing a nostalgic cash grab. The 1999 original had been a genuine cultural phenomenon, and the sequels never recaptured it. That's the real reason this franchise fell apart. It didn't die from a single flop. It eroded across sequels until there was nothing left to revive. And a day-and-date streaming release turned a soft opening into a confirmed collapse. RoboCop. A hard R-rated satire got neutered into a kids' movie, and a single softer sequel dismantled an entire franchise. RoboCop 3 hit theaters in 1993, toned down to a family-friendly rating that gutted the series' signature violence and pitch-black satire. Peter Weller didn't return as Murphy, replaced by Robert John Burke, with reports pointing to scheduling and cost. The film drew the weakest reviews of the series and underperformed, and its distributor, Orion Pictures, declared bankruptcy before it could even release the thing properly. From there, RoboCop spent the next 2 decades wandering through television shows, animated spin-offs, and direct-to-video projects. The 2014 remake with Joel Kinnaman looked like a fresh start, but it made $242 million against a $100 million budget, which still left it short of profit once marketing was counted. And it repeated the exact same mistake, stripping out the original's satirical edge, and it failed to launch anything new. That's the real reason RoboCop keeps falling apart. Both the sequel and the reboot killed the same thing: the satire, the one element that made the character matter. Pacific Rim. When Guillermo del Toro handed off his giant robot passion project, the sequel proved the whole franchise had really been about one director's fingerprints. Pacific Rim Uprising arrived in 2018, directed by Stephen S. DeKnight rather than del Toro. Del Toro stayed on as a producer, but he didn't direct, and his absence reshaped the film's entire identity. On a budget around $155 million before marketing, it opened to a tepid $28 million domestically and earned roughly $290 million worldwide. That was a clear drop from the original's $411 million, and it happened despite 5 extra years, expanded international markets, and stronger brand awareness. The soft numbers forced Legendary to stop and ask whether the series even belonged on the big screen at all, and the franchise eventually shifted to an anime series instead of another film. That's the real reason it fell apart. Pacific Rim lost its author. Del Toro's specific singular vision was the entire draw, and a perfectly competent sequel without him revealed just how little the concept held up on its own. Cloverfield, a franchise that could have gone absolutely anywhere, instead got quietly dumped onto Netflix during a Super Bowl, and it never recovered. The Cloverfield Paradox premiered in February 2018, announced through a surprise Super Bowl trailer for a film almost nobody knew was finished. It had started life as a standalone movie called God Particle, only to be retrofitted into a Cloverfield installment during production. When the budget ballooned from around $5 million to roughly $40 million, Paramount lost its nerve and sold the whole thing to Netflix. The reviews were savage, with one critic flatly calling it a train wreck. No new Cloverfield film has appeared since, and the anthology has effectively stalled. That's the real reason this one died. It wasn't rejected at the box office. It was abandoned by a studio that had simply lost faith. Predator Franchise. The scariest hunter in science fiction got so buried under studio meddling that the series had to shrink down to a quiet streaming prequel just to survive. The Predator arrived in 2018, directed by Shane Black on a budget around $88 million. It opened to just $24 million domestically and limped to $160.5 million worldwide, drawing a 34% on Rotten Tomatoes. Black reshot the entire third act after poor test screenings, cutting whole storylines and characters along the way. It became one of the year's most prominent disappointments, and the planned expansion stalled out. The series only survived by scaling all the way down to the smaller streaming prequel, Prey, in 2022. That's the real reason it fell apart. A collapse driven by creative chaos rather than pure box office. The Chronicles of Riddick. A small, sharp science fiction horror hit got inflated into a would-be epic meant to rival Star Wars, and the sheer ambition sank it. It started with Pitch Black in 2000, a modest, well-liked sci-fi horror film that turned Vin Diesel's Riddick into a cult favorite. 4 years later, The Chronicles of Riddick blew that lean concept up into a lavish space opera with a reported budget north of $100 million. David Twohy and Diesel openly intended it as the first chapter of a planned trilogy, a new mythology meant to stand alongside Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. Instead, it grossed just $115.9 million worldwide, not even enough to cover its budget once theaters took their cut, with estimated losses around $50 million and a 29% on Rotten Tomatoes. Universal killed the trilogy on the spot. The character wouldn't return for another 9 years, in a smaller, cheaper film simply titled Riddick, which Diesel secured the rights to partly through a cameo in Tokyo Drift. That's the real reason it fell apart. The franchise killed itself with ambition, pricing a lean horror concept right out of its own market. Tron. After 8 years lost in development hell, the franchise finally got its third film in 2025, and it promptly became the biggest science fiction bomb of the year. Tron Legacy, back in 2010, was supposed to relaunch everything, but its planned sequel, Tron Ascension, languished for years without moving. Around 2015, Disney scrapped Ascension entirely, reportedly spooked by the poor opening of Tomorrowland. The project was eventually reworked into Tron Ares, a soft reboot built around Jared Leto that dropped the legacy characters altogether. Ares finally reached theaters in 2025, carrying a budget around $220 million, and it grossed just $142 million worldwide, topping the domestic chart with a mere $33.5 million on opening. It's now projected to lose around $132 million, the hardest film of the year to turn a profit. Reports suggest it will likely be the last theatrical Tron for a long time, even as it later trended on Disney's own streaming service. That's the real reason Tron never held together. Across more than 40 years, every single attempt to relaunch it either stalled in development or bombed on release. John Carter. This is the one that lost so much money it took down the head of an entire studio, and it was supposed to launch a grand trilogy. John Carter arrived in 2012, adapted from Edgar Rice Burroughs' century-old A Princess of Mars novels, the stories that arguably invented modern science fiction. Directing was Andrew Stanton, the acclaimed Pixar filmmaker behind Finding Nemo and WALL-E, making his live-action debut, and that turned out to be part of the problem. Stanton reportedly treated the shoot like a Pixar production, scrapping and reshooting footage until the gross budget swelled to roughly $306.6 million, about $263 million after tax rebates. Disney then poured over $100 million more into a marketing campaign that never figured out how to sell the film. It opened to just $30.1 million domestically, landing behind The Lorax, and then dropped 55% in its second weekend. It finished around $282.7 million worldwide, nowhere close to break even. 10 days after release, Disney announced a $200 million write-down, one of the largest single losses in Hollywood history, and the disaster led directly to the resignation of Rich Ross, then the head of Walt Disney Studios. Stanton's planned sequels, already envisioned as a full trilogy, were canceled instantly. That's the real reason this franchise fell apart. It never even got a second film, because the first one was one of the biggest write-downs a studio has ever taken, and it cost an executive his job. If this was worth your time, consider subscribing so you catch every new video. Thanks for watching.